Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles, and I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to get in touch with us with comments or questions or to sign up for a study, you could also sign up to receive our weekly bulletin with the articles that I write weekly for that. You are welcome to give us a call or a text to 812-550-6234, and you can also send email to info@riverridgechurch.org if that's a better way for you to do it. Our worship times are at 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings, and you're welcome to join us for that at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We also meet again on Sunday afternoons at 4 p.m., and then also in the middle of the week on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. we get together for a Bible study as well. You can access any of those three meeting times over our live stream via YouTube. The easiest way to find our channel is just to go to youtube.com/River Ridge Church of Christ, but you can also go to our website, riverridgechurch.org, and there you can find a link right there on the homepage. It's really easy. It'll take you right to the latest live stream. We also have a radio show every Sunday afternoon at 2 p.m., and you can find that on 98.5 FM and also 1400 AM if you're a little bit farther out from the Evansville area. I mentioned YouTube a moment ago, and that not only hosts our live stream, but it also hosts our past services and live streams and Bible studies. A whole lot of information there. You could spend a very, very long time taking in all of that, and I hope learning a lot and getting a lot out of it. And we also have the past TV programs up there for your further study if you'd like to go back and either catch up or re-watch one of the programs that maybe you want to study in a little bit more detail again. And of course, you can find our Facebook page, and that's also a way you can get in touch with us. And as I mentioned a moment ago, our website is riverridgechurch.org. We are doing something different today than you are used to if you have tuned into this program before. Typically, we are looking at a topic or a text, or maybe we're doing another installment of going through John's Gospel and following that story and trying to learn more about Jesus and about the way that John gets that story across. But today we are going to start down a very, very long road toward addressing a shortfall that I see out there in this world today. I have noticed that a lot of people do take God seriously and believe that He speaks to humanity using the Bible, but they don't really have a strong grasp on what's in the Bible. And I'd like to help change that. This video and the series that it's kicking off will be more informational and a lot less devotional than normal. And as a result, I really wouldn't do this in isolation. But the cool thing about YouTube is that I can start with something like this and then build a whole series of related videos, one leading into the next. And the more you watch, the deeper you'll get. And since this will be available on the internet forever, I hope, we can work our way towards slowly building a very large database, a crash course to introduce the Bible and to help readers and people who would like to become students of the Bible to know what they're reading and why they're reading it, especially if it's their first time ever cracking the Bible open. So this first installment is going to be a lot less about the actual word-for-word contents of the Bible and more about the structure and the overall track of the story and the big picture. But even this broad overview will be able to teach us something worthwhile that we can take home at the end of the day. Let's start with the name, the Bible. I'm sure you're familiar with that. We all take for granted what the Bible is, but you probably don't know where it came from. It's from a Greek expression, ta biblia, which just means the books. Yep, it's such an important collection of books that you could just say, the books, and almost everyone would know what you were talking about. The Bible can be broken down into two sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Apart from the obvious difference between Old and New, the Old Testament is about 3 times as long as the New, with 39 books compared to the New Testament's 27. If you're thinking that those numbers don't quite add up, you're right. The Old Testament is 3 times as long because many of its books are unbearably long in comparison to the New Testament's more ADD-friendly approach to word count. The Old Testament can also be broken up into sections. Law, which includes 5 books, history, 12, poetry, another 5, and prophets. There are 17 prophetic books, 5 of which are called major prophets, while the other 12 are called minor. Overall, this is not arranged chronologically, but within each of these sections, there is at least a vague attempt to arrange things according to the timeline, so that in reading the Old Testament, you go through Israel's entire history about 4 or 5 times, looking at it from different angles. Let's look more closely at the first section, Law, also called the Torah. Here you will see Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you know anything about Genesis, you might be wondering, how is this law? Well, there are a couple of commandments in it, but by and large it's concerned with recording the origins of the Jewish nation, hence the name Genesis, which means beginning. It also covers the beginning of God's covenant with Israel. It's not formulated yet, but he has a clear agreement with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Genesis lays that out. Exodus, which means road out or exit, records Israel's escape from slavery in Egypt. From there, they enter into a formal covenant with God, after which he tells them some of his many, many laws. Next comes Leviticus, which means about the things of Levi. You might be wondering, what? Also, who? Well, Levi is one of the sons of Jacob/Israel. You'd know that if you knew more about Genesis. This book covers in excruciating detail most of the regulations for the priesthood. It also includes some law for the whole nation and also a little bit of narrative history. Most people find Leviticus one of the toughest books of the Bible to get through, but it is worthwhile, as it creates a useful picture of how God wants his people to regard him, and that can still teach us a lot today. Numbers is a pretty self-explanatory title. This book begins with a census of the Israelites and then moves into lots of history about the period just after they left Mount Sinai, of Ten Commandments fame. It's sad to see that shortly after they leave, the Israelites are already doubting God and rebelling and generally screwing things up. And there's also some law. Deuteronomy, which means second law, is appropriately enough a repetition of much we would have seen earlier in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, including some of the history. At this stage, the Israelites are preparing to cross the Jordan River, and Moses is about to die. And he gives them 30-plus chapters of reminders, encouragements, and some briefing on what's about to happen in the next few weeks after he dies. And that's the Torah. In another installment, we'll look at just the Torah in more detail, and then eventually each book within it. There's lots of fun to be had here, and lots of confusion too. Next comes the section we'll call History. There are a lot of these: Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. These are presented in chronological order with a couple slight hiccups, and they cover about 1,000 years of Israelite history. 1,000 years is a very long time. That's not going to stop us from summarizing it in under a minute, though. Israel enters the Promised Land, conquers it, and lives there for a few centuries doing stuff, and then eventually establishes a monarchy. 3 generations in, a civil war begins, and it never really quite ends, although there are periods of relative calm, peace, and even collaboration. The kingdom had split, with 10 of the 12 tribes, well, 10-ish of the 12-ish, forming the northern kingdom of Israel, while the other 2-ish tribes became the southern kingdom of Judah. Both halves pretty much ignore God most of the time, or at least when it matters, and he keeps trying to correct them and bring them back in line. There are occasional successes, but also some really bad setbacks. Eventually, God has enough and lets Assyria come in and destroy and deport Israel. He later allows Babylon to destroy and deport Judah. Kind of a trend for a while there in the ancient world. After about 70 years, God lets them return, and they rebuild a client provincial government and religious structure under the auspices of the newly dominant Persian emperor. But not everyone returned, and so by now the Jewish nation is dispersed throughout the Persian Empire and beyond. So that's a lot to cover, but let's sprint through it all book by book as well. Joshua takes its name from the leader who helped Israel take control of the Promised Land. After this, different portions of the land are allotted out to the various tribes and clans of Israel. The next book is Judges, so called because at the time there was no king, as the author tells us with some level of chagrin several times toward the end. Now the Israelites have their own homeland that flows with milk and honey, so it should be a pretty sweet gig. But no. They rebel, God stops protecting them, their neighbors attack them, they complain, and God sends a judge to the rescue. This happens 12 times over the course of the book, with a few related but judgeless incidents thrown in to capture the atrocious chaos of the period. Then there's Ruth, which is the story of a young Gentile widow's love for her Jewish mother-in-law. She joins the Israelite nation, generally behaves in a stellar and exemplary manner, and as a result ends up being the great-grandmother of King David. 1st and 2nd Samuel are broken up due to length, as will be the case with Kings and Chronicles shortly. All of these are quite long and cover a lot of important history. In the case of Samuel, the name is a little weird since Samuel dies before the end of the first part, and in any case, he isn't a major player anymore long before his death. Instead, the book focuses mostly on the first king, Saul, and the second king, David, who isn't Saul's son. There's a lot of drama. 1st and 2nd Kings pick up where Samuel left off with David's son Solomon as the new king. He does some important stuff, and this is generally regarded as, by most measures, the high point of the kingdom of Israel, so it's naturally followed by Solomon's son being terrible and losing most of his kingdom. They end up with 2 fighting factions, occasionally caring about what God says, but generally behaving badly in most respects. Eventually, it reaches a point where God gives up and lets both kingdoms be pillaged and deported. 1st and 2nd Chronicles tell mostly the same story, but with its focus in different places. Generally, Kings is written from a northern perspective, while Chronicles is written from a southern one. They overlap a lot, of course, but sometimes you'll find more information on a particular king or incident in one or the other. And Chronicles doesn't talk much about Elijah or Elisha, who are prophets in the north and get a lot of attention in Kings. After that, we have Ezra, who is a priest and a captive in Babylon, but is sent back to help in the efforts to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem after the general release of captives by the Persian Emperor Cyrus. Nehemiah, from whom the next book gets its name, was governor of Judea during roughly that same period, but his work was mostly focused on rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem to protect it from its neighbors. Esther, a Jewish woman, is chosen to replace the emperor's favorite wife, and she ends up in a convenient position to thwart a racist jackwagon's attempt to exterminate the Jews. Boy, if I had a nickel for every time. So there's clearly a lot of fun stuff in the history section. It's easy to get lost, but the general track of the story is about God's patience and the people's resistance to obeying him. There are lots of lessons for us to learn and lots of shadows of what God was planning to do for the whole world later on, too. Okay, we're running short on time. Let's speed things up. Poetry: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. In Job, a righteous man loses everything and wonders why God hates him. The Psalms are 150 poems, most of which praise God for something or other, while some are prayers, questions, or teaching tools. Proverbs is filled with the kind of advice your grandpa liked to give you before he went senile. Ecclesiastes wins the award for most off-putting of these incomprehensible book titles, but is basically the product of an old billionaire looking back at his life and asking, what was the point? And Song of Solomon is the one we don't talk about. Moving on. Okay, in all seriousness, Song of Solomon is actually a very good book, and it's more important than most people give it credit for, but it includes a lot of sexual innuendo and metaphor that definitely wouldn't make it through the VidAngel filters. That brings us to the last category, the prophets. These are broken into 2 sections, the major and minor prophets. For the major prophets, Isaiah had a long career, lots of visions, and lots of predictions. There's a healthy dose of doom and gloom and judgment on Israel. It's noted repeatedly that idolatry is bad, and also God's mad at everyone else too, but will eventually save his people and raise them up again. Then there's Jeremiah, which is about doom and gloom, and also doom and gloom. There are some positive points in there as well, but depending on how you count, it's often considered the longest book in the Bible, and boy does it feel like it. Lamentations is just a postcard tacked onto Jeremiah, a tragic ballad, or you might say a lament over what is happening to God's holy city, Jerusalem. Ezekiel sounds like a jobless intellectual started experimenting with magic mushrooms and cataloged his experiences. But when you get used to the psychedelic imagery, you find it's actually one of the most collected and systematic explanations of God's complaints against his people and humanity in general that you will find in the whole Bible. Daniel is just like Ezekiel, except this time the author has a job. That brings us to the minor prophets, of which there are 12. Let's see if we can fit them all in. Hosea is forced to be a fleshly analogy for how God feels about Israel abandoning him repeatedly. Joel is about a gazillion locusts descending on the land of Israel as a judgment for their sin against God. Amos is like when dad comes home to find out that you and the neighbor kids got into a fight and somehow ended up lighting the house on fire. Obadiah is like when dad comes home just as the neighborhood bully is viciously pummeling you in the driveway. So it's pretty relieving if you're the son, but not so fun for the bully. Jonah runs from God, gets eaten by a fish, and calls a do-over. Micah is about God passing judgment on his people for ignoring what he tells them, especially the religious and political leaders and rulers. Nahum is a stunningly accurate prediction of how the city of Nineveh would fall because of their, relentless conquest and acts of horrible barbarism in the service of accumulating wealth and power. Habakkuk is a prophet who argues with God and loses. Zephaniah is either about the upcoming days of tumult in the whole Fertile Crescent area or the end of the world. It's a little unclear which. Haggai comes after the Jews return home from Babylon and need a kick in the pants to finish rebuilding the temple. Zechariah has a lot in common with Ezekiel and Daniel, but with more equestrian symbolism. And finally, Malachi covers the corruption of the priesthood in the early days of the Second Temple and a look forward to the coming of Elijah before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. That wraps up the Old Testament, about 400 years before Jesus was born, and with a definite indicator that God has unfinished business with his people, who still show consistently that they'd rather rule themselves than obey him. Then we begin the New Testament. The New Testament is broken up into 3, maybe 4 major categories. First are the Gospels, which all tell the story of Jesus' time on earth in the flesh, culminating in his death, burial, and resurrection as a willing self-sacrifice on behalf of humanity. The first 3 of these, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very similar, and while they have their own perspectives and a lot of unique contents, they overlap a lot. Then there's John, who seems to be from space or something. John strikes me as a Yoda-like figure where you're not always sure what he's talking about, but you can tell it's deeply important. After the Gospels comes the second section, which could be called history, but it's a little silly to put a bunch of effort into nomenclature and taxonomy this time, because it only has one book in it, Acts. This is short for the Acts of the Apostles and was written by Luke as a sort of part 2 to his gospel, telling the story of the early church, mostly through the eyes of Peter and then later Paul. Paul turns out to be a pretty important dude, as the next 13 books were written by him. These fill more than half of the third section, which could be called Letters to Christians. There are 13 from Paul, most to churches at Rome, Corinth, the region of Galatia, and what today is called Turkey, Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, and Thessalonica. He also wrote a few to individuals, Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Some of these churches and individuals received 2 letters. They generally deal with problems each group or person is facing and instruction from God about how to deal with various situations, as well as encouragement and sometimes a rough formalization of Christian doctrine, especially the doctrine surrounding salvation. Then there's Hebrews, which is anonymously written to Jewish Christians about the superiority of Jesus' covenant over Moses's, and why they needed to keep pressing on as Christians without forgetting who they were as Jews. After Hebrews come several letters written by other apostles or major leaders in the early church. James wrote 1, Peter wrote 2, and John wrote 3. It sounds like John was being an overachiever here, but seriously, 2nd and 3rd John are like the ancient equivalents of a tweet. Love one another. Hashtag Thursday Thoughts. Toward the end of all this, Jude wrote a little pamphlet that doesn't get nearly enough love, and then, just when we've gotten used to Christian doctrine in 280 characters or less, John slaps us across the face with a 60s psychedelia-inspired tome of 22 chapters filled with the most confusing and terrifying imagery outside of an H.P. Lovecraft story. Revelation is insanely deep and complicated and has inspired some of the most enduring cultural myths and legends about the end of the world, even though that's pretty clearly not what John is talking about. It's a fool's errand to attempt to explain it all here, or really anywhere, but the basic theme can be summed up in 2 words. God wins. The book that rounds out the New Testament, and therefore the Bible as a whole, is the reason I said maybe we should break up the New Testament into 4 sections, because the Revelation is technically a letter to Christians, which is made evident in chapters 2 and 3. But when you compare it to the other letters, it's like the Beatles. There's John, Paul, George, and, hang on, Ringo? What kind of a name is Ringo? That doesn't fit here at all. Shouldn't it be like William or Richard or something? Revelation is out of place among the letters in the same way, but in fact it wraps up the Bible in an amazingly beautiful and, dare I say, providential way. Just as the Old Testament ended by telling us what to look for in the future, Revelation does the same, but instead of reminding us that there's more to be done, it ends up reminding us that, while it's not all over, the heavy lifting is finished, really. On top of that, it contains some lovely symmetry, with the last couple of chapters focusing on the marriage between the two main characters and their happily ever after story in a newly made garden-like environment, just like the way it started back in Genesis. That was a whole lot of material, and almost no actual reading from the Bible, which is quite a rarity on this show. But I hope that it has primed you to be interested in getting into all of these books in more detail and following the story of God's people, His covenant, and His Son through the ages. What we see when we look at the whole picture from a 40,000-foot perspective is a story of tragedy and redemption. God made man, and man rebelled, losing his right to life. God was patient and kept reaching out over and over and over again, but even His special chosen nation repeatedly turned away from Him, although He'd done so much to nurture, provide for them, and show them how much He loved them. It could have ended there, and it just would have been a tragedy, but instead, God did the one thing no one really saw coming. He became a man and redeemed humanity by harnessing that evil will and letting it propel Him into the position of a sacrificial lamb who is innocent, yet takes on the penalty for someone else's fault, and in so doing bridges the gap between man and God, reversing the trajectory and drawing us back upward toward Him. As He hung on that cross, He said, "It is finished." And it was for Him. He'd accomplished what He set out to do, living a sinless life to completion in exactly the way He'd always planned. But it wasn't until He rose from the grave that it became perfectly clear what exactly He was promising, that the grave won't be the end for us either. If we are willing to mimic the life He led, one of humility, submission to God's will, and love for both God and man, and to mimic the death that He died, both in a watery death, burial, and resurrection, and a steadfast, lifelong, self-denying faithfulness to the covenant, then He promises to raise us from our graves too, and to bring us back to His home, to live happily ever after in His presence. If you want more information on how to do this, or would like to join yourself to a group of believers striving together toward that same goal, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at River Ridge. You can call us at 812-550-6234, email us at info@riverridgechurch.org, or visit us in person at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh, Indiana, and we love to help. There will be a lot more to come in the future, looking at the different parts of the Bible in more and more detail. You can go to youtube.com/River Ridge Church of Christ and subscribe to our channel, or tune in again next week to Iron Sharpens Iron.